to say something, or you just want me to start?
The only thing I'd say, please, well, welcome everybody, and thanks for making the effort again on another Wednesday. Just in terms of something that Tushar picked up on last Friday when Teresa gave her presentation, it is, I think, quite a lot harder for people when they're presenting if everyone's got their videos turned off. And I appreciate there's a good reason to have for everyone to be muted so that the video doesn't bounce around. But I think it would be good practice if as many of us as possible could have their videos turned on, please.
Okay, good point.
Apart from that, Michael has very kindly steps up to present at the last minute. So thank you very much, Michael, and the floor is yours.
Cool. Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks for the opportunity. Can you see my screen, by the way, the presentation?
Oh, yeah. Perfect.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, I want to thank you in advance for volunteering your time the next hour and 10 or so, because we're really looking for feedback. So it's not a presentation to make us look the best way possible. It's a presentation to seek as much feedback as possible. We just 3 or 4 or 5 days ago or so, we finished the first, and I'm not even going to call it a working paper, but sort of the first written version of this. But it's very early days, so please interrupt me whenever. Obviously, sort of the first hour or so, shorter questions if possible, and then leave the longer ones for later on, if that's okay. So before I go into the slides, I just want to sort of give you a very brief understanding of what we're doing. And really, the idea is quite simple. And I've been thinking about this for a long time. And the idea is basically to say that if there's a local sports hero, then they could be able to change particular attitudes and beliefs of people of that local community. And I'm going to give you a few examples of what I mean, but specifically, and I'm going to talk about that in detail as well, but what we're going to look at is Samantha Stosur's US Open win in 2011, where she became the first female Australian tennis player to win a Grand Slam in over 30 years. And what we're going to argue throughout the paper, or what we're going to test throughout the paper, is whether this success of a female rising superstar from Queensland had any effect on the gender attitudes and the gender stereotypes of Queenslanders. And we call it gender stereotypes, but you could also call it gender norms. There are different terms for this, but I think it's going to hopefully become clear what we mean in this paper. And why we choose that win is that's actually, we got quite lucky in the sense that her win was in September 2011. And in the Hilda survey of that year, there were quite a few questions asked about gender. So for example, do you think that men make better political leaders than women? Or do you think that in a relationship, it's the man's role to make the money? That question has been asked in different variations. And we're lucky in the sense that there's actually, it's almost a 50-50 split, that a lot of people were asked before her win, before September 11th of that year, and about the other half was asked after September 11. So that gives us the opportunity to sort of test whether that's, and we're going to call it a quasi-random or quasi-exogenous shock in that sense, whether the people that were asked, and especially the Queenslanders that were asked after September 11, gave significantly different answers to those gender-specific questions than those who were asked before. So that's the basic sketch of what I'm going to talk about. So let me start with a presentation. So I want to start with a couple of examples along different dimensions. And I'm focusing on sports heroes, but you could equally think about politicians, you could think about actors, you could think about any other sort of celebrities or people who became famous for a number of reasons, and whether, and if so, how they might affect their local community in terms of the beliefs they hold on certain dimensions. So one that is quite interesting is a recent one. Mo Salah, who's a football player, and by football I mean soccer, a football player at Liverpool. He's openly practicing his Muslim religion, and there's been a couple of papers about that. One of which from our honor student last year from Braden, who has looked at how people in England and in Liverpool specifically respond to him playing so well. And there's actually quite an interesting chant by Liverpool fans who are singing, "If he scores another few, then I'll be Muslim too." And if we're if we're looking at sort of the relationship between many Western countries and Islam, which has become a bit contentious in the last few years for a number of reasons, then this is quite an interesting phenomenon in the sense that it seems that local people in Liverpool and also people in England in general might have sort of adjusted their belief about Muslims and about Islam a little bit, just because they're seeing this role model, this successful person who's openly practicing to be Muslim. Yeah. And there's actually this quite an interesting phenomenon, because what Braden found last year was actually the opposite of what other researchers have found. But just very generally, you can say that an openly practicing Muslim might have some effects on supporters of Liverpool if he plays well and if he plays like a superstar. Then there are other examples about race. If you go a bit further back in time, I think Muhammad Ali in the United States was a famous example. How he, when he was asked to join the Vietnam War, he gently refused and said none of the Viet Cong has ever called him the N-word, but in the US it happens regularly. So he made race really brought the topic of race in the US to the forefront again. Jackie Robinson in baseball, the first black baseball player. Arthur Ashe in tennis in the United States. They were very successful in their sport. They became heroes, they became celebrities, and then they sort of influenced the public discussion about race in that context. And that's through a number of avenues. I don't want you to think about this in too much detail, but just in general, that if we see celebrities rising, if we see superstars rising, in this case specifically in sports, that this might lead people to rethink certain stereotypes, certain beliefs they might hold, in this case towards race.
Can I just make a query? I mean, the counter, of course, is Israel Folau. I mean, he's a hero in the sense of being a rugby hero, and yet the causation was the other way around. He was saying things that parts of the community didn't like and was forced out of the sport. So, you know, it's often a praise, I guess, but it's a two-edged sword, or it's a reverse causality issue there as well.
Yeah, so he had an effect on how we think about those topics. Whether it's positive or negative is a different question. And in fact, the results we find are a little bit surprising as well. But he did influence that discussion, right? Yeah. You're muted.
Right, unmuted. The issue I'm trying to say is he lost his position. The sport got rid of him. So you can do well in your sport, doesn't matter how well you do. If you do things that violate what's seen as a norm, you're still gone. And so it's the other way. The society's view of what's a norm is getting rid of the sportsman, irrespective of how good they are at the sport.
That can happen as well. Yeah, absolutely. You can talk about Colin Kaepernick in the US, and I mean, this topic alone, we could talk about this for an hour, right? But the only point I'm trying to make here is that often, if such superstars emerge, they lead us to rethink about some of topics associated with race, associated with gender, associated with sexuality, and then the leagues might react in certain ways. Absolutely, I'm not, you know, that's not the point of this. But those superstars might lead us to rethink what we think of certain categories. For example, African Americans in the US. For example, homosexual or lesbians in the case of Billie Jean King, and so on. Yeah, that's all I'm trying to say here.
Michael?
Yep.
So I see one thing common throughout all these dimensions. So it seems like you know, no matter what dimension you're looking at religion, race, or gender. Is there a difference between whether you are the minority in that dimension or not? Like, you know, if you look at the race, if you are the minority, racial group, or gender in terms of, like, you know, women, if women are the perceived as the you know, the weaker part of the gender spectrum. If that same thing happen on the other group, which is like the dominant group, like, you know, looking some sports hero who are Caucasian white men, would that be a different story?
It could be. I mean, so far I haven't told any story yet. I've just cited some anecdotal examples, if you will, about how superstars have led society to think about or discuss certain topics like race in the US. I'm not saying positively or negatively or in what sense, but all I'm saying is if such superstars emerge, then they might lead us to rethink certain issues.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying so far. No hypothesis, nothing. It's just trying to talk about a few examples. There's a recent paper that just came out, I think, a couple of weeks ago about national identity, which I find really cool. And it shows that in sub-Saharan African countries, that if the national football team does well, then people are a lot less likely to identify with their ethnicity and a lot more likely to believe in the national idea. They also find that there's a lot less inter-ethnic violence after the national football team wins. So again, sort of the point is that if there are superstars, sports superstars in this case, emerging, they might lead us to rethink certain identities, certain dimensions along race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality. All right? So again, I'm just giving you a few examples. And all of these have their own stories that we could talk about, but I'm not going to do that here now, if that's okay. Okay, now, yeah.
Quick question. So could it be that the superstars emerge because the context allows for it? I mean, this discussion around religion is already happening, and now there's a space for a superstar from a minority group to, make headlines.
That is absolutely possible, but it's not going to be an issue for our case, I think, at least. Although, if you think it is, then hold that thought and let me know in our setting. So the paper I'm going to present is a very specific one. I'm only going to talk about Samantha Stosur's win at the US Open 2011. I'm not going to make a general case. So one thing, or one hypothesis that we put up is that the hometown of those heroes is very often, they particularly identify with that hero and they relate to that hero. So, and you can, again, there's an abundance of anecdotal evidence. Muhammad Ali in Kentucky, in Louisville, they renamed the airport after him, they renamed streets after him, they built a center in his name, etc., etc., etc. And you can make the same case for these other superstars. What we're trying to test then is if Samantha Stosur is from Queensland, she grew up in Queensland, she practiced in Queensland, Queenslanders identify particularly with her much more so than the rest of Australians. And then what we're going to test is if whether Queenslanders have been particularly affected in the sense that have they changed their gender attitudes, have they changed their gender stereotypes more so than people from the rest of Australia. Yeah, so, yep.
Sorry, can I just a quick question, or maybe it'll come up later. How do you deal with the scenario of the whole Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd stoush that was hot at that particular time? Kevin Rudd was from Queensland, and anyway, maybe that'll come up later on in the discussion.
So this is one thing where I obviously wasn't in Australia in 2011, you were. So I'm hoping you can tell me later on if this is an issue and what we estimate. So here's our specific hypotheses. So this was sort of the general case is whether a homegrown hero can change prevailing stereotypes. And there's a bunch of theories behind that in behavioral economics. Kahneman wrote on this quite a bit in terms of identity. There are different theories, different hypotheses in the sense that if we see a very successful person from an out group, they label it. So in this case, you can imagine if we are males and then we see a very successful female, is that going to change our perception of what the role of women is in our society? So this is sort of, you can see this from the male perception, from a male perspective, you can see it from a female perspective in terms of a role model. So you could think that perhaps girls and women might now feel a bit more confident once they see a successful woman from their own city become very successful, become a superstar. It might provide a role model for them. At the same time, there's theories in psychology that would suggest it might actually threaten women in the sense that they are brought up and they act in certain gender stereotypical ways. And now you see a very successful woman, and that woman might threaten your own perception of what the role of women is in that society. So there's quite a few theories from psychology behind this, and I think we're going to cater to at least one of them, but I don't want to dive into that too much. I think it's fairly intuitive to say that if there's a global superstar emerging who is from your locality, from your community, you could think about how would that, if at all, influence your perception of women and their role in society. That's what we want to test. That's the general idea. And the specific setting, like I said before, is Samantha Stosur's win at the 2011 US Open. And by the way, they actually recently, and we're choosing tennis obviously for one reason being that I know tennis a little bit, but another one is that in tennis is one of the, or probably the only sport where women and men earn virtually the same money, where you have one day dedicated to the women's final of a Grand Slam only. So the men play on a different day, which means that that one day, the stage is only there for women. And that is not the case in most other sports. That's not the case in football. That's not the case in Aussie rules. That's not the case in basketball, baseball, any of these sports. That's not the case, but it is the case in tennis. So a little bit more information about her win in 2011 at the US Open. Her odds to win the tournament before were 33-1. And this was her first and up-to-date last Grand Slam title. So it was really unexpected that she did win it. And like I said before, it was the first female Australian Grand Slam winner in over 30 years.
Sorry, a quick question. How old was she at the time?
Sorry, how old?
How old was she at the time?
She was 27, I believe.
Okay, so mid-career kind of thing.
Yes, pretty much.
Okay.
And in that one tournament, just to give you some more perspective, she won 1.8 million US. And the finals match alone was worth $900,000 US. So just if she lost the final, she would have got 900,000. If she won it, which she did, she got 1.8 million US, which is quite a bit. Eventually, she, at the end of that year, she was given the honor of Queensland Sports Star of the Year. And there's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence that we do have that shows how Queensland in particular honored that win of her own and sort of respected her win and cherished that win. So I want to briefly talk about why does this matter? Why do we talk about gender stereotypes? Well, this is just, isn't this just talking about what people think and what they believe and how does this really matter? Well, there's a bunch of papers that show that gender stereotypes, both from men and from women, and when I talk about gender stereotypes, I mostly mean our perceptions about the role of women in society. And there's a bunch of papers that show how these gender stereotypes, both from men and from women, affect the gender wage gap, for example. They affect hiring decisions. They affect teachers' behavior towards students. So for example, do I encourage a girl to do math or do I encourage a boy to do maths given the same scores, et cetera, et cetera. Long literature behind this. Tushar, I'm sure you know about that in the context of education, for example. When we talk about career choices, we know that gender stereotypes influence women's decisions what to study and what career to select. We can also talk about intra-relationship bargaining, about household chores. Is it the woman's role to do household chores? Why not? Why would it be equally shared, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So gender stereotypes or gender norms, if you want to use a more general term, are prevalent in a lot of decisions and affect a lot of outcomes in our societies. So to give you some image also of this, this is the ceremony after her win. She beat Serena Williams 6-2, 6-3, which was very surprising, and anybody who does follow tennis was really sort of shocked by this. And I want to give you a little bit of evidence as to why Queensland was really specific and why Queenslanders were specific in respect to that final. So what I'm plotting here is the television ratings in Queensland versus the rest of Australia. So the right bar always shows you Brisbane, and the left bar shows you the average of the 4 other big cities, which are Adelaide, Perth, Melbourne, and Sydney. So in 2005, the Women's US Open final, you see television ratings were about equal. 2008, when Serena Williams beat Jankovic, again, is about equal. And then in 2011, when Stosur, who's from Queensland, beat Williams, you see the television ratings in Brisbane were much higher than they were in the rest of Australia. Now, and you can
you go full screen?
Full screen?
Thanks.
Is this better? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, so I know this is a bit small, but really we don't need to talk about the exact magnitudes. The point I'm trying to make here is that in 2005 and 2008, really, it was about the same between Brisbane. Television ratings were about the same between Brisbane and the rest of Australia. And then in 2011, it really spiked up a lot where Queenslanders were watching the final a lot more. And in 2015, it went down to almost being the same again. I'm picking these 4 years because these are the 4 years where we have data on gender stereotypes, gender attitudes of Hilda respondents for. But you could take other years and you'd see very similar dynamics in the sense that it was virtually the same in Brisbane and the rest of Australia. And then 2011, there was massive interest from Queenslanders in this final, and less so comparatively speaking from the rest of Australia. You could also, we also in the appendix have plots for the men's final television ratings, and again, they are more or less the same between Brisbane and the rest of Australia, also in 2011. It was only in 2011 for the women's final that we see this massive spike, which sort of supports our assumption that Queenslanders, and I'm going to use the term treated in that sense by Stosur's win, as opposed to the rest of Australia that will serve as our control group in a classical difference in different setting. Very briefly about existing gender stereotypes. So worldwide, 90% of women and men alike hold some sort of bias against women. I know that's a very vague statement, some sort of bias, but I still found this to be really large. More specifically, 50% believe that men make better political leaders than women. This is worldwide. And in Australia, just again, a little bit of anecdotal evidence how we are doing in terms of gender stereotypes, gender norms, whatever you want to call it. In this country, Australia is ranked 23 on the Global Gender Inequality Index. Switzerland is #1, Netherlands are #3, and we are in about the same league as Canada, Japan, and the UK. And New Zealand, surprisingly actually to me, is ranked 34 only, and the US is ranked 41. There's also, I used the latest date of Hilda where gender preferences of the next child were elicited. And in Australia, more than twice as many respondents prefer a boy over a girl as their next child. Which before I looked at this, I didn't think there would be any difference, and wow, there's a big difference, which is quite interesting in its own right. And that's one question, incidentally, that we're going to look at, because Hilda asked that question, is what gender, if any, would you prefer your next child to be? And you can give 3 answers. Yeah.
Is that based on national data, or what's the sample size?
It's nationally representative data in Hilda, and how many do they ask every time?
Oh, that's very surprising.
They ask about 15,000 maybe?
Yeah, it's a big database.
15,000, Alison, is that about right?
Yep, correct.
Yep. Oh, okay. So it's supposed to be nationally representative. That surprised me. A bit more anecdotal evidence. The Herald Sun, they had to shut down the comments section for articles on women's Australian rules football because of hundreds of sexist comments. And this is, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. And then there was a headline which still baffles me from the New York Times in 2017, girls in Western Australia gain right to wear pants and shorts to school. That I still don't fully understand how that works here, and the whole gender separated schools and whatnot. But again, that's sort of a discussion in its own right, but just sort of to set the stage for gender norms, gender stereotypes that we still hold in this country. And at this point, I'm not saying whether they are right or wrong or positive or negative, but just to sort of highlight how men and women, boys and girls are treated differently still in Australia. This is, apologies for the dirty windscreen, but this is one of my favorite pictures I took when I came to Perth. There was a new apartment development, and the advertisement read, "Your wife wants me," which carries all kinds of implications to me in terms of gender roles in a relationship. And it just, I still don't fully understand how you can put that up. And by the way, I was in violation of obviously regulations here because I took a photo with my cell phone while driving, but I couldn't resist. It was so wow. So that was Scarborough in 2017, by the way, and I still can't believe it. When I show that to my students, they always can't believe it, but that was 3 years ago. All right, so that much about gender stereotypes in Australia. I could talk about this a lot more probably, but just to set the stage a little bit. Now, what could we expect? I've sketched the scenario a little bit. Stosur's win in 2011 at the US Open, and how theoretically might Queensland women react to her win? So one option is that they would see her as a role model, which could decrease their gender stereotypes. Another option is that they see her win as threatening their own lifestyle that does follow gender stereotypes. So for example, if Queensland women were actually living those gender stereotypes in the sense that they accepted that role of the woman should be the household, should be taking care of the household, should be taking care of the kids. The man is out there to make money, and political leaders should be men, not women. If they believe that, then such a successful woman over a sudden that comes from their own local community might be threatening their own lifestyle and their own belief system. And then there's also an interesting question about parents, and specifically mothers of daughters and sons. So you could think again about either direction. You could think that mothers of daughters, for example, would think, finally, there's a female role model. Now I'm actually loosening my gender stereotypes as well, and I'm going to try and raise my daughter a bit more equally and less gender specific. Or you could think it would go the other way, in the sense that they feel threatened in their own parenting style that maybe is based on gender stereotypes. Yeah. So this could go either way, theoretically, in terms of how Queensland women might be affected by this. And of course, they might not be affected at all, right? If we start from a purely rational perspective, then they shouldn't be affected by this at all. How would this add any additional information to my belief system? Well, somebody has to win the US Open on the women's side. It might as well be a woman from Queensland. Why would that affect my belief system at all? Then similarly, you could think about Queensland men. They could think that Stosur's win might present a threat to them. Now women can even be successful at sports. What other domain is left for us men? You know, women maybe shouldn't even play so competitively. They shouldn't earn that much money, etc., etc. All of these arguments you read quite frequently, especially about men when they talk about women's sports. Or you could think about something that's in the framework of Kahneman and Miller's 1986 theory about stereotypes, and they talk about in-group and out-group, where such a successful person might actually lead somebody to change their belief system about what women are capable of doing. Oh, if Stosur, if one of our own, can actually win that tournament and make that much money, be so successful, then maybe women aren't that bad after all. Maybe women are actually a lot more equal to men than we thought. Maybe they might even make better political leaders. Maybe they might deserve more equality in relationships. Yeah? So all of these are sort of grounded in, these theories are grounded in psychology, behavioral economics, and some of anthropology as well, if you like. And then we could talk about fathers of daughters and fathers of sons, which we could talk about similar dynamics as when we talk about mothers. Right, let me get to the data. Or are there any questions up to this point? No? Okay, so the 2011 Hilda survey surveyed thousands of people in Queensland and the rest of Australia. And some of them were surveyed before her win and others were surveyed thereafter. And this is quite ideal for our setting because it's very unlikely that there's a selection bias. It's very unlikely that the Hilda people have said, hey, we're only going to interview people with certain types of gender stereotypes after September 11 and others before that. Now we're going to be able to control for that because we can compare other waves in 2011, 8, and I think 15 or so. Oh, yeah, 8, 15, and one other, to 2005, I think. We can compare that setup during the year and who was interviewed when, and then compare that to the 2011 survey. So we're going to run eventually a difference in different setting. So in a sense of exogeneity and endogeneity, what's quite nice for us is that it is very unlikely that the Hilda people specifically selected some people to be interviewed after that win of Stosur and others before. One reason of this is that, well, it was really an unexpected win, and there are 4 Grand Slam tournaments throughout the year. This happened to be the last one, but it was really sort of out of the blue that she won that tournament. And another reason is, of course, that I doubt that those people who run the Hilda survey would orient their surveys on the Women's Tennis Association tour and when they play where and so on. So it's really unlikely, I'd say. Yeah.
A question about it. Do you have information about which parts of the city were surveyed at which time?
Yes, we have the date and we have the postcode of the person if we want to use that.
Could you maybe run some controls or tests around the income or something like that? Because one thing that I might be thinking is that maybe they were sweeping the city by neighborhoods. Probably some neighborhoods had, I don't know, tennis courts or something, and it could.
Yep. They do that, and the before and after varies along some observables, one of which being income. But A, we can control for that. And B, there's reason to believe if they did this in 2011, they did it in a similar way in 2008 and 2005 and 2015. So, and that our difference in difference will be able to control for that. But that's a good point. Hold that thought until we see the results and see if it still bothers you. So the two main survey items we look at is the first statement is, it is better for everyone involved if the man earns the money and the woman takes care of the home and children. And they ask respondents, how much do you agree with that statement? I think it goes from 1 to 7 or 1 to 10. I always mix it up. But basically 10 would say, I strongly agree. And 1 would say, I strongly disagree with that statement. So anything higher on that scale would indicate more agreement with that statement. And the second main statement we look at is, on the whole, men make better political leaders than women do. Same thing, higher values would indicate more agreement with that statement. So in a sense that higher values indicate stronger held gender stereotypes. And then our third set of results also looks at child preferences. Very simple question. What do you prefer your next child to be, boy, girl, or it doesn't matter? So there's 3 possible responses. To give you an idea of the survey distribution, this is how it looks like. They start in June 27th, and then it goes until the early months of the upcoming year. And before that question comes up, our results are consistent. If we just look at ±4 weeks, for example, or ±6 weeks, results are consistent. But in the main setting, in the main results, we're going to use the entire survey wave, so that entire set of data here. But it's really, if you think about it, we got quite lucky with that event being almost sort of in the middle of these surveys. Right, here's some very basic descriptive statistics, which also gives you some ends, although I understand that's probably small in parentheses below here. But here I'm just looking at women, and on the y-axis I'm plotting the agreement to the statement, better if man earns the money. So these are the non-Queensland women before September 11th, average around 3.2. The non-Queensland women after Stosur's win, and it's a lot lower already, which is interesting because that's not the ones that we think might have been treated specifically because Stosur's not from their community. The Queensland women before are up here, and the Queensland women after, so you see no difference basically between the Queensland women before and after. One thing you can also see here is that Queensland women are holding slightly more gender stereotypes than non-Queensland women. And I think if I ask the Australians among us, there's a long-held belief that Queensland is a bit more socially conservative, I believe is the appropriate term, than the rest of Australia. Michael's smiling, so I take this as confirmation. And when we look at the men, so again, these are just descriptive statistics. I'm not controlling for anything, so relax if you don't see anything there, or if you're worried about confounders, just basic descriptive statistics. If you look at the men, non-Queensland men before, they are up here, so it's the same scale than for the women. So they hold more gender stereotypes than non-Queensland women. Non-Queensland men after, again, here it doesn't differ much to before. And then here is where we see a major gap. The Queensland men before Stosur's win are up here, and then after her win, the gender stereotypes seem to be much lower than they were before. Same picture for the second question, men make better political leaders. You basically see the same dynamics.
Quick query. So when you're talking about before and after, this is in 2011, right?
Yeah, sorry, only 2011 at this point. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I should have clarified that. Yeah, so for the second question, whether men make better political leaders, you also see that Queensland men before September 11th to after September 11th, responses are lower, less gender stereotypes than before. Again, very descriptive, not arguing any causality yet. Right, now here's the first empirical strategy we use is a simple difference in difference strategy for that wave in 2011, where we predict the gender attitude, I call it here, but I could have called it gender stereotype, gender norm, whatever you like, of individual I, and that's a function of an after dummy a Queensland dummy, which we take as a treated, if you want to take a difference in difference language, and then the interaction term between those two, between after and Queensland. And then subject to control variables, which are the usual demographics, income, educational attainment, age squared, married, separated, whether the respondent has children, fixed effects for each weekday, because you could think that maybe on the weekend a person would indicate more or fewer gender stereotypes, I don't know. We can also control for individual experiences, whether they were fired, whether they were divorced, whether they were attacked in the last year, and so on. There's a number of controls we could put in, and if we do that, our results are consistent. So basic difference in difference setup. Yeah? Okay, all right. And we standardize the dependent variables because that makes it much easier to interpret magnitudes. And then we estimate this equation first for the full sample, and then for women separately, and then for men separately. Yeah? And why do we split women and men? Well, because that theories, or those theories from psychology and behavioral economics that I quickly alluded to, sort of, they make differences between women and men. And obviously, when we talk about gender stereotypes, it's a different issue whether I think about my own group and how societal norms relate to me if I'm a woman, or how societal norms relate to the outgroup if I'm a man, and how I think about women. So I think there's a fairly intuitive reason to split those samples between men and women also. And we will see substantial differences between these two. Then in the second empirical strategy, it's a tad more complicated, but essentially what we do is we pool all those waves where people respond to these gender questions. So like I said, I think 2005, 2008, 2011, and 2015 are those where those questions are asked. And what we do put in then is an interaction term between being interviewed after September 11th, being from Queensland, and which wave we're in. So that essentially controls for Juan Pablo if we say that maybe after September 11th, they would always interview areas where gender norms and gender and beliefs about gender are systematically different from the rest of the country, beyond the observables of income levels and educational attainment and age and so on, then we might have a problem with the basic difference in different setting. But given under the assumption that that distribution of who is interviewed when doesn't change throughout the waves, then we can control for that here with that difference in different setting.
Do you actually have this information on what's the distribution of interviews in every round before and after the specific date?
Yeah, but so do you mean the ends, or what do you mean?
No, I mean the way interviews were conducted spatially.
Oh, okay.
On the rounds, do you have an idea of how actually it was conducted? Because if it was conducted in a similar way, then this obviously bolsters your argument.
Yeah, we can check that. That's a good point. Because we have the postcode, so we can go down to postcode. Good point, yeah.
First check could be just to check the starting and the end date of the surveys.
Mm-hmm.
Always start around the same time and always end around the same time. Because if they don't, then your distribution is moving.
Yep. Yeah, it would be moving. Yeah, you'd still have to argue for other things to confound our results. But yeah, we can check that. That's a good point. Yeah. And then X is, of course, is the same set of control variables we had before. And like I said, for this difference in difference specification, we use waves 5, 8, 11, and 15. And that's the only ones where those gender questions have been asked. It's not that we handpicked some. That's the only waves where we have that information. Right, let me show you some results. Difference in difference settings, so only looking at wave 11 in 2011. The first coefficient is the interaction term between Queensland resident and being interviewed after the US Open final. So that's the coefficient of interest. In the full sample for the question whether it's better if the man earns the money, you see no statistically significant difference. Then if we do it by women, we actually see, and that's quite surprising, marginally higher, stronger gender stereotypes for women, but they're marginal, 10% significance, so hold your horses. And then for males though, we see strong negative and statistically significant, which would indicate that Queensland men have significantly revised their gender stereotypes downwards after Stosur's win. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to interpret these as strictly causal and so on, but if you believe our identification strategy of difference in difference, then you can interpret these as causal. What you also find is that Queensland residents in general hold stronger gender stereotypes in the full sample and for men, not women. This is after we control for all these variables that I just introduced. And here's the coefficient for after, which I think is a bit less interesting in this setting. Yeah. So the first takeaway from this is sort of that it seems that Queensland men were affected a lot more than Queensland women. Then let's look at the second outcome variable in columns 4 to 6.
Michael,
again, here in the, yep.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So here in the table, so the coefficient of the Queensland resident and the interaction term in magnitude is almost the same, right?
Yep.
Just the signs are opposite.
It's almost the same, which means that difference between
and the absolute value.
The dependent variable is standardized. So this would mean that it's going down by 10%.
So this question is very close to the motivating graph they have shown. So it means that at the beginning, initially, so the Queensland residents, these scores for this question is higher than the non-Queensland residents.
Yeah.
That means of the US open final, then the Queensland resident become to the level of the non-Queensland resident.
Exactly.
Back. So I'm just wondering, so what is the mechanism behind this? Is there anything that means now the Queensland become to the average of the non-Queensland resident, which is the rest of Australia? If we think the rest of Australia, the country average is like the Queensland come to the country average of this US open final. I don't know whether it's just a coincidence or something else drive this.
Well, it could be a coincidence, of course, but hopefully I'll manage to convince you that not all of it is a coincidence. One hypothesis that would be consistent with that is that men, after seeing a local, we call it a heroine, but a local successful woman, after they see that they readjust their gender beliefs, their beliefs about gender roles, their gender stereotypes downwards, in thinking that, oh, maybe women aren't just confined to these gender stereotypes that we have, and maybe we should loosen these gender stereotypes. Now, if you do that consciously or subconsciously, I can't tell you. I can show you one estimation about potential mechanisms later on, but you got to give me a few minutes for that.
Michael, can I ask a related question about the interpretation? Yep. So you're saying that it seems like the Queensland males have revised their expectation, but it could also be that the non-Queensland males have revised their expectation in the opposite direction. So a woman from Queensland wins, our women didn't win it, right? So maybe, we are giving them a lot more leeway than we should. Well, I mean, just like, it's a theoretical possibility, and yep. I think you can separate the two out. Can you?
Sorry, I didn't get that last part.
So it's a theoretical possibility that it's the non-Queensland men who are revising their expectations in the opposite direction. That'll also
Yeah, theoretically that's possible. But then shouldn't I see a coefficient that's statistically significant on the after US Open final? So that would be this one right here, which a little bit, I guess you could argue that.
Also, if it's differential across Queensland. So Queensland males are fine because they invested in their women and actually performed really well. But now Western Australia is thinking that we were investing quite a lot in our women and they didn't win it. Queensland won it.
Yeah.
That investment.
So, yeah, it's possible. Yep. Simon?
Okay. Women and men are equally exposed to this news about her win?
Yes, we have television ratings by gender as well, and they're relatively similar. And either way, it was on every newspaper that day, so I don't think anybody did not know about it.
Okay, or maybe it's not just the exposure, but men and women, if they feel they're different in terms of how enthusiastic into the sports or tennis, so same news might mean different things to different people. If I care more about tennis, that probably will have a bigger impact on me. If I don't really care about it, even I'm aware about this news, but that doesn't mean too much to me. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think that's theoretically possible.
So yeah. I was just wondering why this men-women results could it contribute to you don't really find much effect on women.
It's possible, but if I look at television ratings, I don't have the exact numbers now in front of me, but I think they're relatively similar for Queensland women and for Queensland men. So if what you were saying was correct, then the television ratings, for example, for women in Queensland should have been much lower than for men to watch that final.
Right.
Which I don't think they were. I'm recorded, so I don't want to say something that is not right, but I think if I remember correctly, they are not very different from each other. Mm. But yeah, that's something we should look at. You're right.
It's really a quick question, Michael, if I could just interject. I mean, one issue with Gilder is the sample size is very small, right? So you're looking at one state here, so I'm just wondering in terms of numbers, like before and after the open win, so in terms of males and females, I mean, it could be that you just don't have many females and that maybe that estimate is not as precise as it could be.
Yeah, so here's the N under that, and I should have maybe written that larger, but men in Queensland before, 819, men in Queensland after, 658, women, 911, 706, so more or less the same, I'd say. Mm-hmm. More or less.
Michael, I'm going to take
Chris?
a question.
Yep.
I think Michael's after me. Two things very quickly. Your treatment here is a little bit confusing to me in the sense that your treatment is that the people that watch the television match that happen to come from Queensland, right? But then everyone else in the country also receive that treatment if they watch tennis, which because it's the Australian Open, they almost certainly would have. And so
it's Open, yep.
Yeah, but is somebody in Queensland, for example, that isn't a big tennis fan, like Simon said, going to be as treated as somebody that's in WA that does love tennis? So there's that aspect. But then I think a little bit in terms of like the Sutvar assumption, most people in Queensland live down in Brisbane, right, which is right on the border with those that live in New South Wales. And there's lots and lots. It's one of the densest populated areas in Australia. And so the idea that somebody watches it in Queensland that does like tennis, so they're officially tweeted, but they could very well go out the next day and meet a whole bunch of people that aren't from Queensland and have some kind of influence on them as a consequence of them seeing this wonderful match the day before, and that's worrying, I think.
Yeah, that's probably one of our biggest worries. How we started the paper was to say we take the local community of where the player is from as the treated. Yeah, and then because the tournament was in the US, everybody was watching it on TV, or if they actually traveled to New York, they saw it there, but that's really unlikely.
It's the US. Sorry, that's yeah, fair enough. That will make things easier.
Yeah, but that's one of the main concerns, and that's one I have as well. Because, like you said, if I'm a big tennis fan and I watch it in Perth, I might be perhaps even more treated than somebody who doesn't care about tennis in Queensland.
Yeah,
that is true. But it does go along with this sort of this anecdotal evidence, and some, I think, again, in psychology, I think there's some evidence that local heroes, it's much easier for you to relate to, much easier for you to identify with, and that's sort of what we're basing that identification strategy on. Now, if that wasn't true at all, we shouldn't see anything statistically significant on that interaction term, I think. But you're right. Ideally, we want to ask those people: Did you watch that final? How much do you care about that? And then we could identify them as treatment if they before that said they're interested in tennis, for example, and sports. But that we don't have.
But then also the second part is they meet lots of other people, right? And then they obviously can communicate their subjective opinions, and that's another concern. But anyway, sorry, Michael, please.
You're right. You're right. Yeah. Which Michael?
Michael McClure, I believe, had a question because he's very politely put his hand up at some point, which I've not figured out how to do yet.
I'll be running out of time, I can already tell. That's fine.
It's on the screen. Chris?
No, it's fine. It was an earlier question that I raised. I just forgot to remove the raised hand. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sorry. After you, Michael, go for it. I won't crack a joke. You've got limited time. Go on.
Yeah, Michael, I know you want to focus on the change in stereotype in the society. The question from Sam about the difference between women and men, just very strange. We're supposed to, with the winner, it should boost the woman's confidence, and but it seems there's no impact, right?
I'm going to show you some impact there in a minute, but it's not like you'd expect it. It's going to go the other way.
That's my first point. Second point is 2 questions: only money and income and political leaders. It's a very different question, right? I don't know whether you check the political background during that time in Queensland or not, whether that affected the answer to the question or not.
Yeah.
So if I put it another way, so it measures the confidence. So same, there's no impact on women, but definitely men are losing confidence in terms of earning income after the win.
Yeah. So there are other questions about intra-relationship gender attitudes. And for example, one asks whether women's main role in life is to be a mother and to have children and things like that. And our results are generally consistent there. But I'm going to mention those in robustness checks. And we chose those 2 for the main ones because they are used in most of the papers from the US, mostly in other countries. So that's why we selected those. But I could have shown you other results and they're consistent with those.
So Michael, related to Yenri's question, I think the women are quite similar, quite the same between Australia or the non-Queensland, according to your graph that you have shown before. But the men in Queensland is quite different from the men in the rest of the Australia before the US Open. Is that right?
So let's look at this one. Well, the men are always higher on this one in all of them than the women.
I know. I mean,
women. Okay.
Yeah, I mean the men are quite different in Queensland.
Yeah. So if you compare this one to this one, it's not significant, but this one to this one, it is. This is, bear in mind, this is without controls, right? But yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. That's related to Yenri's question, I think. As what's related to my question, what is the mechanism that drives what you identify here? Why only men have some effect here? It seems to me that just men in Queensland just come to the average of Australia of the US Open.
Yeah, possible. Maybe let me it's one. Let me go through the rest of the results, and I think some of it might be a little bit clearer, hopefully, because we're going to look at mechanism in one way, but this is certainly an area where we'd like as much feedback on as possible. All right, anything else about this table for now? Good. Okay, let me move to the difference in difference results. I'm going to spare you all the other coefficients, and I'm going to go with Ken's golden rule of not having cluttered tables. So here's the coefficient of interest. And again, I'm showing you for the full sample for the first question, nothing. For the women in the first question, nothing now, although it's still positive, but not statistically significant. And then for the men, same result again, negative, strongly significant, 15% of a standard deviation decrease in gender stereotypes. Men make better political leaders, same result, almost same magnitude, 15% of a standard deviation, nothing for the full sample, nothing for women. So these are our main results, and I'm graphing them for you as well. If you're interested in magnitudes, I compare the coefficients that I haven't shown you here. So that's, for example, one standard deviation in income is associated with a decrease of minus 0.05 of a standard deviation, and the effect we identify is quite a bit larger. In fact, the effect we identify is comparable to 40% of a bachelor's degree. So if you want to think about what correlates with gender stereotypes, then we see better education is usually associated with much lower gender stereotypes. And holding a bachelor's degree is associated with a decrease in gender stereotypes by almost 40% of a standard deviation. Our effect is about 40% of that. That's just to give you a rough idea as to how big the effect is, or how big the coefficient is that we do derive. So it's meaningful, but it's not blowing everything out of the water, which I think is quite reassuring. Similar for men make better political leaders. Yep.
I just have a few queries that I can't hold till the end because I have to rush off for a Zoom meeting. So I'll just ask them now. I've seen your difference results. And my first query is, so I'll ask this uncomfortable question, and I'm sure you must have heard this before. So what happens if we go the other way, which is that the emergence of a local heroine, as you're saying, is due to the fact that the change in gender stereotypes was more pronounced in the area that actually produced a local heroine. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now I'll give you something that'll help you, and that is that your time frame, your frequency is very high. Okay, so had it been 1 year, then I would have said probably I don't really believe your results as much. In your case, it's a few days, I think, right? Or whatever, a few weeks, because it's before and after a date, and you're seeing a large result. But still, I think that is a point that has to be addressed. Maybe you're addressing it later on, but I think that is a point that you have to address, why the change in gender attitudes is not resulting in the emergence of the leader.
Mm-hmm. I'm not worried about this at all, but we need to describe it. Yeah, because she's 27. She's in the middle of her career. She's been a professional tennis player for over 10 years.
Yeah.
Within that time frame, I doubt that's a problem. But we need to talk about it. Yeah.
No, but it's not to do with the heroine's age. I'm talking about the emergence of the leader because of the attitudes of the local region. Yeah. Which is quite different, because what you're trying to test is the effect of the leader on attitudes. But I'm saying it might, the emergence of the leader might actually be because of the attitude of that region. That's point one. Point two, I don't know if you're doing this, but it might just be, at the moment, because you have this great news and you're asking people right at that time, that, what's your view about gender, and you find a big effect. How persistent is it? I don't know. So if you're checking it for, say, for example, the 2015 round, that'll be great. And if you see the same persistence, that would mean that, yes, this actually had an effect before and after. Because asking right a day after or a week after this news is something amazing, but how persistent is the effect is also something I think would be interesting to see. Are you doing that, by the way?
No, and I don't want to. Because within 4 years, think about it, within 4 years, so many things happen. Exactly. And I really doubt if we'd find anything there, I wouldn't believe it, because within 4 years, no way I think you'd still be able to identify it. And you won't have before, after then. So you'd have to, it's just a very long time. And there's so many things that do happen, like the political developments with Julie Gillard and so on, all of these things. And then, so many confounders. I don't even want to do that. Now, the other answer, and it's a very important question, is short run versus long run. Is this just something that lasts for maybe a few weeks and then it goes away? Even if that's the case, it will have tangible effect in society. Why? Because in those weeks, teachers will teach children, HR departments will make hiring decisions, wage decisions will be made, career choices will be made. All of these decisions that I was listing earlier will be made in those few weeks. So even if we only identify an effect that lasts for, let's say, 8 weeks, it's still meaningful. Yeah.
So even if it's not persistent, it's important.
I would argue that very strongly. Yes, it's still important. Now, of course, ideally, I'd like to know how long does it last. That would mean I'd have to have consistent interviews throughout the next weeks, months, and years, but that we don't have. And I don't want to look at 2015 for that, because within 4 years, I think every referee would beat us over the head with that. So many things happen in 4 years in Queensland and the rest of Australia that might inform gender stereotypes. There's no way you can identify that. And I wouldn't even want to argue that. I don't think that's the case. No. But yeah, that's good point.
Mike, going back to what you said, that teachers will be teaching in that period and career decisions will be made. Well, that assumes that what you measure will percolate into action, right? I mean, and you have
absolutely, yeah.
So I'll be careful and
well, there's just a paper coming out in QJE that only measures attitudes as well, no tangible outcomes. But that's one of our main concerns. But the paper in QJE looks at Norwegian soldiers, and they're assigned a female soldiers in their group, and then how their attitudes change. So anyways, but that's a very good point. So let me get to...
Just a quick question. Couldn't you check the results by week after the exposure and to check how the magnitudes change? Maybe that will give you a sense of how persistent the effect is over time.
I could, but of course then samples get much smaller.
Of course, yeah, but I don't know. How many do you have? Like 900, 600?
Yeah, 600-700 after for males, and the same for females after in Queensland.
Maybe break it down by week or I don't know, fortnightly or something.
Yeah, I think I tried that at some point, and it's just it's too noisy, too messy. Okay, let me.
I'll just interrupt very briefly again, Michael. Although Hild is nationally representative, is it also representative at the state level? Stupid question, but if you really are pushing the Queensland thing so much, it needs to be representative, and I do. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yep, we have to check that. I haven't checked that. Maybe Alison can tell me something about that later on. It is? She's muted, but I think she said it is. So there you go. All right, let me show you some results for child preferences, which I found shocking, to be honest. So difference in different setting again, with controlling for all the variables I've listed. Are you more less likely to answer you prefer a girl as your next child? No difference. Prefer a boy? Males, again, negative, statistically significant, strongly so. Doesn't matter. Males are much more likely to say the gender of the next child doesn't matter. So it seems to have influenced gender preference of the next child as well. Alternative gender stereotypes. So this, yep.
Is that from the same question? I mean, this child preference?
Yep.
And so how do you create, so you create this?
A dummy.
3 different dummies?
Yep.
But they are mutually exclusive. So if you choose one, then that will affect the outcome on the other one. So what do you do these 3 separate ones?
Well, I generate for the first 2 columns, I generate a dummy whether you said you prefer a girl, yes or no. Second one, prefer a boy, yes or no. Third one, are you saying the gender doesn't matter?
Right. Okay. So it's because there's 3 categories. So okay.
If one goes up, the other one has to go down, yeah. But I want to see which one and where. So for example, are you more likely to say you prefer a girl now? That doesn't seem to be the case. You're more likely to say it doesn't matter and less likely to say you prefer a boy.
So Michael, do some people just give the inconsistent answers to these 3 questions? Logically, so prefer girl, that means, okay, if the prefer girl dummy is 1, that means prefer boy dummy should be 0.
Yes.
Otherwise, it would be inconsistent, right?
Yeah, you only give one answer. You only give one answer. These variables are generated from one answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. All right. So some alternative gender stereotype questions that were asked. It is not good for a relationship if the woman earns more than the man. Whatever career a woman may have, her most important role in life is still that of being a mother. And a woman has to have children in order to be fulfilled. So all sort of different variations of gender stereotypes. And like I said, we don't select these in the main specifications because these are not the most common ones used in the literature, but results are consistent across those. Statistical significance levels vary a little bit, but the basic direction is the same. As a placebo, we also look at a survey done in New Zealand at the same time. You don't see any change in women's or men's gender stereotypes in New Zealand around that date. Now, actually, I'm going to skip those in the interest of time. I want to look at parents because that's, I think, the most interesting result so far. So we then split by the parental status of the respondents, and I'll be done in maximum 5 minutes. Sorry, Chris. So we then look at only mothers in the first column and mothers of daughters here. So this coefficient of 0.102 is only pertaining to mothers of daughters. And in that sample, we see that mothers of daughters actually increase their gender stereotypes by 10% of a standard deviation, which is really interesting. So it seems like they don't see Stosur as a role model, but rather potentially as a threat to their own parental style, maybe their own parenting style, as a threat to how they perceive the world and the role of women in society, and perhaps how they are raising their daughters. But that's something, I don't have kids, so I'm counting on the parents among you to give me some really great intuition on that coefficient. And then for the men, you see a consistent result to what I've shown you before. So fathers of daughters decrease their gender stereotypes. And it's the same for the other question pertaining to politics. Parents of sons, so these are mothers of sons. Again, the same thing, they raise their gender stereotypes. They hold stronger gender stereotypes after Stosur's win. And fathers of sons decrease them, but they decrease them marginally less than fathers of daughters. But the difference between these two coefficients is not statistically significant to make any statements. So by and large, that is consistent. Fathers of daughters and sons give consistent answers, and so do mothers of daughters and sons, but they go in the opposite direction in supposedly holding stronger gender stereotypes. Now compare that to the sample, the respondents without children. So in those samples here, I'm only using those that don't have children at the time. Again, for men, consistent result here. It's not statistically significant in conventional levels when we talk about men make better political leaders, but still consistent sign and so on. And nothing for the women here. So this positive coefficient for women here seems to be reserved for mothers and mothers of sons and daughters alike. They seem to go the other way. And that I find really interesting. Well, what's quite curious is that actually both my co-authors, Wayne and Kerry, are sort of suspicious of that result. Maybe I shouldn't say that now, but I find it quite intriguing actually. Because the first result of men decreasing their gender stereotypes, that's sort of cool, that's interesting, but that women and mothers specifically raise their gender stereotypes is something that I was quite surprised by. All right, and then I have a slide with conclusions and then some potential policy implications. But in the interest of time, I want to stop here. And I already thank all of you for your comments and questions. I don't know how much time you want to give everybody, Chris, but yeah, either way, thank you very much for listening.
Michael.
No, thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Yes. Michael, I put a message on the chat book, in the chat.
Yeah. Yes,
there was a major political event in early 2011. It was a big reshuffle in the government on the Miss Blythe's premiership. So I don't know whether the result is affected by that or not. Referring to my earlier question, whether women is better political leaders or not.
Yeah, we need to look at that, and that's where, like I said, I wasn't in Australia in 2011. That's something I need to read up on. Yeah. Thank you.
The question, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry, Michael. I'm just getting back to, I mean, do you think your results are generalisable within Australia? You know, we spoke a little bit around the fact that Queensland is a you know, a bit of a separate beast politically, especially. But the other thing I would add is, I mean, Sam Stosur is a little bit unique as a sports person also. I mean, my mother follows tennis, and I think Sam would have to be one of the most frustrating players to support because she consistently chokes, you know, and maybe, you know, her win could be, you know, an exhilarated sort of effect that could be more short run. You know, I mean, does Sam represent, you know, the average sports person? I don't know. I mean, also in terms of her, you could say something controversial, but I mean, a lot of women don't necessarily relate to her because she is, you know, people say that she's not that feminine, et cetera, et cetera. She doesn't give much in interviews and these sorts of things. So, yeah, I guess the question is more around, you know, how generalizable do you think these results would be?
Well, what I think and what we'll say in the paper are two different things, right? What I think is that generally those such superstars, and not only in sports, but in other domains as well, I think personally that they have a tremendous effect, especially on young girls, but also boys along those dimensions. Because I think all of us, if we think back, what we wanted to be in our lives is at some point we wanted to be a football player maybe, or a musician, or whatever sort of our favorite pastime was as a kid. And in some ways they teach us certain elements of you can be successful in your domain if you choose to do so. But that is only the case if they, along the dimensions of race and gender, represent you. So I personally think that if a girl never sees a successful female politician, it's incredibly hard for her to select that career. But that's my personal thoughts. Now, in terms of the paper, we're not going to say this generalizes to anything, but we need to carefully look at what sort of implications would we take from that if we did, and if we perhaps had more evidence down the road of different cases as well. So I can list you, I think, 4 or 5 other Grand Slam winners, first-time Grand Slam winners in different countries, but for those we didn't find survey data around their wins, so we couldn't test that. But I think it's quite possible that this happens quite a bit. Sean?
Yeah, thanks. So Michael, I'm just wondering, so here you just regard the whole Queensland as a treatment. So yes. I'm just wondering, so it's quite flexible to define the hometown, right? So the hometown could be a town, could be a city, could be a suburb, and could be a state. It could be the whole Australia. So here that means whether you can just get the distance, for example, the distance between the people in the survey and the real, for example, the birthplace of this tennis player.
Yep,
and
we could do that.
Interact this distance with the treatment. I think this could just help you to also answer to sort out the questions that again raised, because now there's some also confounding treatment in Queensland in 2011. If you just include the distance to deal with these issues. Yep,
that's something we can do. That's a good point. Yep. Thank you.
Can I just ask a question, whether this would expect to be the reverse? When Sam Stosur is expected to win the next Grand Slam and she doesn't, are we going to get the reverse results? And if we do, on the probability that she's likely to win as much as she loses, the effects just wash out. You know, you're going to get one series when she gets a win and another series when she gets a loss. Now, obviously, it can't be tested because the information's not there. But that would be my expectation. If you've got a particular result from one event, that the reverse of that event should presumably unwind that, and the net effect would be 0.
Well, that's tough. I mean, it's kind of related to what Michael said, is that, she disappoints on a frequent level. I think she's one of the most successful female athletes in Australia for a long time and has made, I don't know how many millions. Yep. But it's kind of, in many countries, that's what happens. Somebody wins a big tournament and then they don't win the next one. They go, oh, what a failure. What's happening? Why do they lose in the final? Which is an incredibly rough critique of an athlete. But yeah, theoretically, I think that's possible. If we could test it, we would. And especially, she always performs poorly in Australia. I think that's what you meant, Michael. Palmer.
No, I'm personally not saying whether she's going to win or not. So I understand Michael's point. But, you know, players win and they lose. There's a 50% chance they'll win or 50% chance they'll lose on average, I guess, when you get there's the 2 candidate thing. So there's got to be as many wins from prominent heroines as losses from prominent heroines. Well, that's why my suspicion is that it would just wash out.
Well, no, it's not a 50-50 at all. There's 128 women in the main draw and another 64 in the qualifying for every tournament.
No, but once you get to the final.
Yeah, but she didn't get to any other final anymore.
Didn't she? Okay.
No. This was I think.
One off.
Yeah, I think her best other result in the Grand Slam might have been quarters or semi-finals.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a one-off. I mean, she's still playing, but she's outside the top 100 now, so I don't think she's going to have another one.
Okay.
Okay, everybody. I think I'm going to call it there because we've gone over a little bit already. It was a very productive conversation.
Sorry.
I think it's getting late, not least for Kerry, who it must be ridiculous o'clock in the morning. Is it 6 o'clock in the morning for you now? Coming up? No, 5 o'clock past. So hat tip to you, or hats off to you. Brilliant. To the rest of you, thank you very much. Michael, great presentation, stimulating. Thank you. And yes, I suppose, who's presenting next week, Michael? I forget.
Oh, I don't know from the top of my head. It's on the schedule.
I shouldn't have brought that up. Okay, so thank you to all, and please do follow up with Michael if you've got any further questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Great paper. See ya.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Take care. Thank you, guys and girls.
Bye.
Thanks, Michael.